To the next talk in the 2021 series of OpenUK's Future Leaders Training sessions. Please note this meeting is being recorded and will be made available soon afterwards on our YouTube channel. First, a little about the OpenUK Future Leaders Group. The Future Leaders Group is a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, open hardware, and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding, and innovation, as well as private practice lawyers and in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. It operates under the direction of OpenUK's Legal and Policy Committee and has a clear purpose to bring together and develop future leaders in legal and policy matters relating to open technologies and to support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. The Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Brunels from Phil Fisher, and Katie Gibson from Bristow's, and we're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The group is always open to new ideas and to new members, whether getting involved in all of our activities or just dipping in and out of our various projects, so please do get in contact if you'd like to get involved. And for today's session, we're pleased to be joined by our very own Amanda Brock, CEO of OpenUK and the chair of the Open Source and Intellectual Property Advisory Group of the United Nations Technology Innovation Labs. Amanda has conducted significant research over a decade into commercial models of using open source, from writing her first book chapter on this to revamping that chapter for the book Free and Open Source Law, Policy and Practice, being published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. The book will be open access and will be released both for e-readers and via PDF, thanks to the sponsorship of the Vitesh Foundation. And we're also very lucky to be joined by Matthew Buck and Adam Tinworth from Journalism. Journalism are artists and bloggers that work live to create a paper and digital record of conferences and other events, and they're gifting us a drawing and live blog for our talk today. And with such a good subject, I can't wait to see what the drawing and live blog looks like, to be honest. So, as usual, we'll have chance for questions at the end, so please do pop them in the chat. And we'll invite you onto voice and video to ask them if you'd like to yourself at the end. Amanda, welcome to our session today, and thanks for joining us. And over to you to talk about commercial models in using open source.
Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you to so many people for turning out to join a video call. I know it's not the environment that we all like, and particularly to journalism for coming along, and I hope we'll provide a bit of light relief at the end with some of the drawings that they've done on today's session. So as Robert said, I'm Amanda Brock, I'm CEO at OpenUK. Some of you will know me from before OpenUK, and for 25 years I was a lawyer and I worked in tech for most of that. I'm going to just very briefly, because I could talk about this particular topic today for hours, run through a little bit about OpenUK myself. We completely revamped the organisation in January 2020, as many of you will know, and we created a vision, mission, purpose. Our goal is to develop and sustain UK leadership in open technology. Now, that's not a xenophobic, inward-looking type thing. That's us world-facing and trying to develop leadership across the globe. We do that across open technology. If that's a term that you are not familiar with, get familiar with it. Open source software, open hardware, and open data, the three opens, as John Laban, who I think is on the call, describes it. And what we found last year as we started to build out our various projects is that they sit on three pillars. And those three pillars are community, legal and policy, and learning. Now, the first of those, community, last year you will have seen both our awards where we had over 100 entries, and the fact that we had a bit of fun at New Year, and we created an honours list of some really worthy people in the UK who are very definitely world leaders in their fields. And that honours list went pretty viral on the 1st of January, I'm pleased to say, and congratulations to anybody on the call who was part of that. This year, with our community, we will host a second award sponsored by Bristow's. That will be announced in the next few weeks, and I believe that the nominations process will start after Easter. The actual ceremony is not going to be held till November this year. I think the 11th, but we'll confirm shortly. Now, around the same time, we're moving the organisation to an elected board, and half of the board will stand down. The board of 12 amazing, internationally recognised folk that we have there. Half of them will stand down, and supporters will be able to elect them. The following year, the other half will stand down, and they'll be elected ongoing for 2-year terms as board members, maximum of 2 terms. If you are a supporter, you will be able to stand or vote, and I wanted to communicate that with this group today. You can sign up to be a supporter on the website. We also have a number of ambassadors. If anybody's interested, please take a look at the site. It tells you what you get and what you give to be an ambassador, and we would love to have more of you engaged. I mentioned legal and policy. Obviously, that's where this Future Leaders group comes from. We respond to all new legislation in the UK that is appropriate or relevant to Open. We're actively engaged in discussions with the Cabinet Office and DCMS. We were the only, I think, non-US organisation to submit an amicus brief with other open source organisations in Google v Oracle looking at APIs, and we should hear something about that pretty soon. You get a sense of some of our other activities there. Christopher Eastham Fieldfisher is the chair of that group, and it has a mix of people who are in private practice and law firms on the legal side, but you don't have to be a lawyer to be involved in that, and we have some non-lawyers. We also have policy work, which is largely non-lawyers, I have to say, looking at 5G Open RAN as part of our Future Telco group, working on Gaia X as part of the cloud and infrastructure initiative, and also looking at circular economy and the sort of data center environment of the future as part of COP26. And you'll see that group is actually, to my mind, one of the best in the world and truly amazing. And within a few months of being formed, they were recognized on this site, the author site, which is the European Commission's open source observatory, and they recognised OpenUK as the strategic player in the UK. You also probably have already heard something about the learning work that we do, and last year we created our first kids course in competition. We will be running that again thanks to Red Hat sponsorship, and Matt, who's drawing this talk, is also the animator from the kids course, and you can see a little bit from last year there. On a personal level, I have a few roles. You may not know how I do it. I don't know how I do it right now. It's flat out, to be quite honest, but I also work with OIN. OIN is the world's biggest defensive patent organisation protecting open. If anybody would like to join, it is absolutely free, and I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards. You can see as a patent non-aggression community just some of the values there, and it now has, this slide is slightly out of date, almost 3,300 licensees agreeing to cross-license their patents. And I'll mention Microsoft's journey to that towards the end. Rob mentioned that I am the chair of the UN's Technology and Innovation Labs Open Source and IP group. Sadly, the labs have been closed, and that is coming to an end, although we are trying to find a place for the group so that they continue to influence the UN. I sit on a number of boards like the OASIS, Open Projects One, and KDE, and as Rob mentioned, I am the not only editor of the commercial chapter, the commercial models and open source and contracts chapter of this book for the second time, but for the first time I am the editor, and I think that will be the first and only time that my name is on the front of this book as editor. I have never undertaken a project that has been so much work, and I'm so committed to it because it is going to be such a great thing. And we have 24 chapters by 20 authors who are frankly world-leading experts in their field, from Pam Chestic on trademarks to Mark Radcliffe talking about blockchain and open source, to Andrew Katz talking about open hardware. The book is being published by Oxford University Press and will be published in either July or September, But you'll see at the top, I've taken this from the Veitch Foundation's website, and I just want to pause and thank the Veitch Foundation, because their incredible sponsorship means that this book will be an open access book, which means there'll be an e-reader and a PDF available for free. You'll be able to dip in and out of it as students, as communities, as well as people in business. And I have to say, I'm super excited that we're able to give this to people. My chapter is commercial models in open source, as we've said a couple of times today, and that's going to be the subject of my talk. Now, the chapter is 15,000 words long, and that's a lot to pack into an hour. I could talk to you probably for 3 or 4 about it. I will be writing shorter articles, blogs, and speaking at a number of conferences on this. And I've sort of made an executive decision about the way I'm going to take today's talk, which I hope will be okay with you. And that's to talk about recent events around Elastic, etc. So I will build up the story to try and give you context and explain my thinking on all of this, and the background and the why. It's the first time I've done it, so please cut me a little bit of slack. You know, if I'm a terrible speaker, I'm a terrible speaker. But if I am not quite accurate, or you think I've got facts wrong, I really appreciate positive feedback, or feedback that's negative, that's constructive. And here's me. And this is the other thing I do. I go around talking at events like All Things Open and today's session, advocating open source as part of my role at OpenUK. So how did a nice girl like me end up in this space? Well, I'm actually, I believe, celebrating an anniversary today. And I think this is 13 years to the day that I joined Canonical. I joined Canonical on a 3-month contract, and I was meant to leave them and go and work for Amazon afterwards. Within 6 weeks, there was no way I was leaving Canonical, and what had happened for me is that I'd engaged in open source and began to understand what it really was. And when I joined, I thought I could tell you what open source was, but it would be a lawyer's contract definition. 13 years later, every day of life, I'm learning more and more about it, and I doubt I'll ever stop learning. I find it absolutely fascinating, and I think it's an amazing thing. And Canonical, as you probably know, is one of the world's biggest, definitely Europe's biggest open source companies. Does a multitude of things, but it is the commercial sponsor of the open source operating system, Ubuntu. And obviously, joining as the general counsel, the first lawyer there, setting up the legal team and scoping the sort of remit of that and running it for 5 years was an incredible experience in open. But I had to start somewhere, and I started by learning what open source was and what it was all about. In the October of 2008, when my first year at Canonical, this report came out, and this deck, first slide by Matthew Aslett, was a year or 6 months later at an Eclipse event. Now, you see it's titled Open Source is Not a Business Model. And that was the biggest revelation, I think, that came out in the open source business side in 2008. At the time, Matt Acey was running an open source business conference. You know, there was a real focus on the development of open source in businesses. So this really was a headline-hitting report. Over 140 companies were surveyed about how they worked in open source. It included people like Oracle, so it included companies who had just an involvement in open as opposed to open at the center. And it identified a few different ways that money was made, and it recognized that choices about licensing, choices about your revenue model all fed into how you commercialized open source, whether that was dual licensing, open core, or plain true open source. But I think the most important thing here is to understand what open source is and what it isn't. The open source is a licensing methodology and a methodology of creating software. It is something which is code that is released publicly, but is also licensed on an open source license. And to be an open source license, it requires to comply with the OSD, the open source definition, which is the custodian is the Open Source Initiative. And in my mind, it really ought to be a license that's approved by the OSI. And there are many of those. There is very little need for anything that goes beyond that. What it is not is a business model. And working in 2008 to 12 with Canonical, I worked closely with its founder, Mark Shuttleworth. Now, as we go through this session today, I'm going to talk about open source Underdogs quite a bit. I'll share more information at the end, but I absolutely love their podcasts. And Mark's podcast for Open Source Underdogs talks about business and open and his business. And he talks about how open source is enabling competitors with your own innovation. And that is what you do. And in a slightly vulnerable moment, he explains that can be draining. That can be both emotionally and financially draining. Now, that's really important to understand. And when I left Canonical, I spent 2 years in a law firm. I was too early stage, really, I think. And what I was doing there was advising people on open source. I also made decisions about what I would and wouldn't do as a lawyer and what I would advise people on. And as the former general counsel of one of the world's biggest open source companies, you can imagine entrepreneurs would come to me and want to open source their businesses and their projects. So I had a steady flow of people coming in. And before we started to work out whether or not they would open source something, we started with my what if theory. And the what if theory is specific to open source, and it is, what if you create something that is core to your business, that is your product or your package, and you share it? And what if somebody comes along and uses it? Because if it's open source, that's what they can do. And, generally people kind of got that and they weren't too excited by it. The next layer is, what if somebody comes along and takes what you have created and shared on an open source basis and makes a lot of money out of it? And often I would see people starting to think that through. They might look a bit less happy. Then I would get to, what if somebody takes what you have created and shared open source and makes a lot of money out of it and you do not? Or you don't make as much money as you want to, or you just don't make as much money as them. And there were quite a number of people who came and talked to me who never came back. I didn't do the legal work I could have if I hadn't been honest with them. But there was no point in sending them down a direction of open sourcing something that did not fit with a business model for them. They had to work that business model out. Now, Matthew Aslett in this report identifies a number of models, and there aren't many. They also identify 80 plus variants, which are different combinations of bits and pieces that make up the model, whether you are true open, whether you're community-based or not community-based, whether you are hybrid, blah, 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 blah. But they come down to a handful of overarching business models, which are really around support, subscription, engineering services, providing implementation, that kind of thing. There are a few others, but there are not many, and I've made a decision not to go into huge depth today on the ins and outs of each of those models. I will do it another time at another venue, but I think there's some more interesting stuff that we should get into today. So I've talked about Canonical, and I obviously have a great affection for Canonical. I dedicated 10% of my life to what Canonical and Ubuntu do, so it matters to me. I'm still invested in it. And at the time, Red Hat was a massive competitor for us. Now, one of the things that we did was take a position in the cloud marketplace. Simon Wardley was the director of cloud at the time. I think actually it'd be a really good idea to ask Simon back to talk more about his thinking around all of this. And he's an amazing speaker, so if you haven't heard him, please try to. And Simon will tell you that Ubuntu went to over 70% of the cloud market. I can't remember if it's 73, 76%, almost overnight, taking market share from Red Hat. Now, the beauty of that was the market positioning, the uptake, all the benefits you get of having a business that's based on open source. You freely distribute it, you avoid a lot of the procurement processes, you can become ubiquitous or abundant by being everywhere and becoming a de facto standard. You can have 70+% of the cloud market but not get any revenue out of it. Therein lies the problem. You can become 70+% of the cloud market without really generating any revenue. So we were fighting tooth and nail against Red Hat, and we were their competitor, and we were taking the cloud marketplace. But actually, you have to look at the economics of all of that and how they stack up. But at the same time as we were fighting tooth and nail with Red Hat and taking that cloud market off them, we were also building collaboration with them. And some of you will know this. It's from 2012. Canonical was one of the founders of the OpenStack Foundation and invested heavily in it, including lawyer time. And the lawyer time was mine, and I was involved in the infrastructure setup of OpenStack. Now, what I want to mention that for really is to demonstrate co-opetition. And co-opetition is massive to open source and its success in business. And this is a way that open source works beautifully as a business model. So in the day, Canonical and Red Hat would be competing tooth and nail. Intel and ARM would be, Intel and ARM, Dell and HP and many others. Yet they were able to sign up to this foundational piece of work where they were able to collaborate, to share developers, to have the most diverse group of people driving to creating the best code with many eyes on it, and to share the investment in the lower end of the stack. And we don't just see that with OpenStack, we see it increasingly with the Linux Foundation, with Eclipse and others, where we have more and more of these institutional collaborations. Mirko Bohm writes really well about it, talking about non-permanent collaboration to create infrastructure. And this is something that open source excels in, and that collaboration is something I think we will just see more and more and more of across sectors. And Finos is a great example of that going into the fintech sector. Between 2008, when we see the Matthew Aslett's report, and 2016, Nadia Egbal did a lot of work on how contribution was made, and we saw that a lot of it was the work of the individual as opposed to the corporate, so not the OpenStack environment I'm talking about. One of the difficulties when you try to assess that is when you look at the repos, whether it's GitHub or GitLab, that the norm in our industry is for individuals to contribute in their own name. So in many cases, they will be paid. They may be paid by multiple companies. They may be paid by one, and it's not always clear whether or not contribution is paid. And that's something, as we see the European Commission look at their economics and the new report they're bringing out, and other work from Harvard, Linux Foundation, etc., that we need to look more at. We will at OpenUK, in fact, be bringing out phase 1 of our report in March, and then we will be doing more reports through the course of the year on the state of open in the UK. But to some extent, I think this Roads and Bridges has dated more in the last 5 years than the work done in 2008, because I don't think the business models have really changed dramatically. But I think there has been an increasing onward, upward shift in payment of developers. And part of that is things like the infrastructure projects, and part of it comes down to companies like Tidelift, where they are finding ways of paying the maintainer. Also, we've seen a step in by some of the big foundations post-Heartbleed, where they're trying to make sure that projects are maintained and that developers need to eat, right? And something that really resonated with me last year, I was on a panel with one of the founders, I'm trying to remember his name, it will come back to me, and he was talking about the fact that you have a right to eat, and I completely agree with that, right? So as we talk about commercial models and what's open and what's not and how you make money out of it, you have a right to eat, you have a right to have a home, you have a right to make money. Nobody's trying to say that you don't. And one of the things that has changed, and I think has accentuated the payment of developers, is the platform economy. Now, many of the other authors in the book were able to just take their old old chapters and update them. I really had to start from scratch, because what I'd seen in Canonical with this environment where it could be emotionally and financially draining was that partly that was a shift to a cloud and a platform economy that caused some of that drain, and that the models didn't entirely fit with it. And what we've seen is not just OpenStack, Open Infra, but the cloud native foundation really come to the fore. Now, if I was guessing, I would guess something like 70 to 90% of the code that the public cloud is built on is open source. And in this card, you can see, this card was created by a chap called Dan Cohn, who sadly passed away last year, and he's greatly missed. He was a big leader in open source, working with the Linux Foundation. Dan created this card, and you can see this overview of Cloud Native and the open projects in cloud. You're looking at nearly 900 cards, but look at the market cap, 15 trillion plus and funding of 15 billion plus. It is incredible. Some of these packages and products have become de facto standards, and they are the very heart of the cloud economy, and every business benefits from them. You know, I didn't even put Kubernetes against its logo because everybody knows what it is. And what we see is that cloud economy taking us through to 2019, when this was shared by the New York Times, December 2019. And I was really surprised to see this piece, not just because it talked about Amazon in the way that it did, but that it focused heavily on open source companies, but not entirely. And it wasn't framed as an open source issue. It was framed as a platform, big tech, cloud environment issue, that many of the smaller companies felt that their software was being reused, or they weren't being rewarded for that, or that they were being locked out of this competitive economy. And the lockout and the lock-in happens in the service layer, or in the tooling around cloud environments, as I understand them. And what we see is that it's possible, if you do not allow competition into your service layer, for a cloud company not to allow others to come in and make money. but still to take advantage of their code because it's open source. We see lock-in, where customers use one particular or hybrid cloud with multiple particular companies, but it's not vanilla anymore, so it's not easily interoperable. And that's something I'm going to come back to because in a way it is an open source issue. Unsurprisingly, Amazon responded pretty strongly, and they had Andy Gutmans write this blog. And I have to say that Andy is right. In using software from companies like Elastic, where the software has been shared on an open source license, there is no obligation for companies to do anything beyond what is in the license, and there is no restriction on them using it, and there cannot be. And this is something that causes confusion. I'm just going to pause and talk a little bit about licensing. Now, I am part of a group of open source lawyers where they are probably the world's leading licensing nerds. I am not one of them. I could not recite licenses to you, and I don't get excited by it. I get excited by the commercialization. But I understand open source licensing well enough to tell you that you cannot discriminate. You cannot discriminate even if you mean it well and it's well intentioned. So if it's an ethical license, it will not fit within the OSD and will not get OSI approval because you cannot discriminate. And that's at the core, it's at the heart of open source. Now, there is a slight confusion where if you look at Creative Commons, which is not a suite of licensing for code, it's a suite of licensing for things like this presentation, non-commercial does allow that kind of discrimination. And I see lawyers who are not part of my nerd group who do look at the licensing around Creative Commons and assume that there must be a way to exclude commercial usage of code. If you do that, you are not doing it on an open source license. So there was nothing that could have been done on an open source license to exclude Elastic or exclude AWS or anybody else from using Elastic's code that had been freely distributed through choice on an open source license. And what we saw around 2018, as well as this piece that came out in 2019 in the New York Times, was a bunch of different companies doing different things. And there's a bit of a chronology of that in the book chapter that I won't go through in detail today because I don't have the time, but we can talk about at the Q&A or we can talk about in another session. And what we saw was a response, partly, I think it was funded for Redis Labs, or created for Redis Labs and FOSSA. The Commons clause is an add-on clause, and the idea of it is that you add it to open source licensing, I think initially designed for Apache 2.0, and what it does is create that restriction on commercial usage. So it becomes like a Creative Commons license, non-commercial, which means that you can take my code, it is publicly available, you can use it on these open source terms, but don't use it commercially. Can I just be really, really clear? That is not open source. You might want it to be open source. You'd need to change what open source means to make it open source. It is not open source. And even if you look at their website, you will see that it says that it should not be described as open source. I would go further than that, and I'd be more definite if I was writing that. I'm not sure that there are many companies who actually use it, and personally, I think it ought to be withdrawn. I think that would be the right thing to do with it. So the Commons Clause has the impact of taking an open source license and code that is licensed on open source and stopping future licensing of it being open source. We have a second document that came out around the same time, and this is again 2018, version 1, you can see the dates there, and this is with MongoDB, a database company having similar issues with the platform environment. An SSPL is a license. You can see it's compared here to a GPL. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of the license, but it is a proprietary license. I've been having quite an interesting chat with Matt Acey, who at one point worked for Mongo, on Twitter, and he didn't actually say it was to me, but it was clearly to me if you read the thread, and he gave me a bit of a ticking off for describing licenses as proprietary. Now, I feel as an ex-lawyer a sense of duty and obligation to be clear. My understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected, is that licenses are either proprietary or open. I can't find anything to the contrary. And I don't think that proprietary is necessarily a dirty word. I spent a long time working on proprietary licenses before I got into open source, and I've done some since. It's a contextual thing. Depends on what you're doing, what's appropriate. So this is a proprietary license, let's be clear. Both Commons Clause and SSPL came from Heather Meeker, and this is a piece that was written in TechCrunch talking about it. And Heather clearly has taken a slightly different approach to me. I took the what-if approach to discussing this with my clients when I was in private practice, and she's gone down the route of SSPL and the Commons Clause. Now, that is all well and good, and it is all fine, but the way that it's done has caused confusion. And it's caused confusion because for many years we've talked about the fact that you cannot discriminate, you cannot say that there is a restriction on commercial usage of open source. And the way that some of this has been shared, whether intentionally or not, is a bit disingenuous. And this is Shay Bannon, the founder at Elastic. Now, Elastic was founded in 2012. Contextualize that, that's when I was getting to the end of my time in Canonical. The cloud and platform environment had been kicking in for a couple of years. The report from Matthew Aslett had been made in 2008, so we'd heard about how you could find your business models and how you would integrate or interact between choosing your license and your business model early stage. And I don't know who worked with Shay on the Elastic business model, but they've made a very clear decision to move away from open source and move on to SSPL, as did Mongo. And that decision is absolutely fine, and it's driven by economics. I'm saying it's absolutely fine. I know some of the community whose work has been contributed through the CLAs that they've signed. That work now obviously is being redistributed on a proprietary license, and they may not be happy about that, and I've seen grumblings about it. But that's what it is, right? It is moved from open source to proprietary. There is no problem with doing that. It is something that's legal, but I find this branding confusing. So doubling down on open. And then if you look at the commentary from Mongo here, from Dev, who I think is he CEO or chairman at Mongo, and he's talking in his Twitter feed about some pushback on Mongo's license decision. They'd stop using blah, 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 blah. And then it talks about OS, our OS software. And that's the thing that worries me, because it's not OS software, it's not open source software once it moves onto a non-open source license. Past releases are, but future ones are not, unless it's also licensed under an OSI approved or OSD compliant license. And in January, we saw this really unusual step where the OSI came out and actually said that SSPL is not an open source license. And there's a bit of history there. So with SSPL, it was submitted for the OSI approval process. It did not get rejected, but it was withdrawn. And I think that's interesting to see. They use the term FOPEN, which is implying that it's open when it's not. This behavior that worries me because it causes confusion. And I think we really need to be clear. You may have seen that it's not just a legal response, but a technical response, as you would expect from the communities. And already we've seen a fork of the Elastic piece. And there's one thing about Elastic that I will mention that I don't know the ins and outs of at the moment, but they had a trademark dispute with Amazon. And if their trademark has been infringed, that isn't right. I don't know what the status of that trademark dispute is, and I've not been able to find where that litigation has gone. So if anybody knows, I'd be interested in hearing more. But their license usage is not problematic. Well, it might be problematic, but it's not illegal. So how are we going to see solutions to this? How is this cloud and platform environment going to fix? Well, in April 2019, before the piece even came out in the New York Times, Google had already gone about setting up some arrangements to revenue share with a number of open source companies. I haven't found any more in the press about it, but my understanding is that that program is scaling. So we're beginning to see the cloud companies recognize the value of the open source that sits underneath their services and wanting to share. And I think what Google's doing is the right route. I read that Grafana have entered into a similar deal in the run-up to Christmas with AWS. And I do think that we'll see more and more of this in the next 12 months. So that will help to fix the business model. There was a piece last night in Computing. I tried to update my slides quickly. This is a bit squished, so I'm sorry. And they talk about a third route. Now, this third route is not new, and this third route is again causing a bit of confusion. So I've talked about open and proprietary, and that software licensing is one or t'other. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be something different. It just does not yet exist. And if you want to create it, you have to go and build it. So back again in April 2019, there was a lot happening that month. I and many of the open source lawyers, a couple of hundred of us, 200-300 of us, met in Barcelona. We meet once a year in a non-pandemic environment. And there was a lot of talk about the Commons Clause. Now, we meet under Chatham House rules, so I can't attribute anybody, but I can talk to you about the event. And I can say that the Commons Clause was received, I was going to quote Billy Connolly there, but it's a bit rude. It was not well received, let's put it that way, right? So the open source legal community does not like the Commons Clause, is a fair statement and a fair summary of the event. But I had been talking to, in particular, a friend in New York, Emmett Hickory, earlier in the year, and he was talking a lot to me about public source. And I happen to believe that the developers, not the lawyers, own the code, right? I mean, technically you do, it's your copyright. So my view is that our jobs has been to be a scribe and to write down, to help you understand the legal concepts and to write down the goals you were trying to achieve. And Emmett was explaining public source to me as something that was like open source but didn't have a license. Now, whether it was being created accidentally through lack of understanding of the licensing or whether it was being created because it's what people wanted, I didn't know. But there was a bit of talk about it at that conference, and Matt Acey in this computing piece yesterday is talking about shared source. He uses a different term from me. I use proprietary public source because I want people not to be confused between public source and open source. So it's not because I'm ticking anybody off. It's not because I'm giving you a row for using proprietary. It's because I think we have to be clear, and I don't want to see more confusion or us perpetuating it. This third way, as Computing talked about it yesterday, is an alternative to both proprietary and open source that would allow for sharing of code without an open source license and the sort of thing that SSPL does. Now, at the time, because I thought it was what some of the development community wanted, I spoke with a number of other lawyers, I won't name them, and I suggested it to the room full of open source lawyers and tried to get some engagement. I then set up in January 2020 at FOSDEM in the legal dev room a session saying that the OSD is out of date just to provoke conversation. Now, I don't think that. I do think everything has to be kept under review and we have a duty to always be thinking in that way. But we have thousands and thousands of packages and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. I think there's 30,000 open source projects that could go into the LF at any point in time if they could adopt them. So, you know, if you look at this scale on open source, which means it has to be certain and you can't mess around with the OSD, you can't really go back and change it. What you can do, as Matt's suggesting and Microsoft suggested with their shared source concept, and I was talking about with public source a couple of years ago, or proprietary public source, is that you look at a new model. Now, if that is really wanted, it is not open source and it needs to be built. There's obviously stuff that you can leverage from, but it's not it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of work and it's going to take a lot of investment and time. And it's something that in the meantime, I think we have to be clear is not open source. And I would really think it would be very helpful if everybody could start, you know, making clear that those licenses like SSPL are proprietary. Now, Matt Acey's talking about it as a third way. I actually think there's a fourth way, and I'm not sure that we will need the third way as a solution, because I think the fourth way is coming, and the fourth way isn't just GaiaX, which I'll talk about in a second. The fourth way is the response for all small companies to the infrastructure that we now have, the cloud and platform economy, the platform infrastructure that we all rely on. And I think what's happening there is that we see the regulators begin to understand the importance, we see them begin to understand the finances. It's not just open source companies that have a problem with some of this. The interoperability isn't there. You can't move easily between cloud providers. You can be locked in or locked out. And I think what we're going to see is a move, which could be regulator driven, to opening it up. Now, we've seen with the European Commission and their talk in the last year or two, 18 months maybe, on digital sovereignty and data sovereignty, their active pursuit of opening up data. They want citizens to control their data. They're talking about making data privacy a human right. You know, citizen data is going to be central and really important. But also we're going to see data and the interoperability and the opening up of that data fundamental not just to businesses' business models, but to governments going forwards. And that will require an opening up in the cloud environment. Now, these people running these cloud companies, whether they're small or big, are not stupid, right? They've been around the block a few times. They understand this. They hear the messaging. They will, I believe, be opening these things up, as we have seen with Grafana and AWS, and as we've seen with Google already over the next few years. But I think in particular, we will see a lot of that this year. And just as a heads up for anyone who doesn't know, I mentioned GaiaX, I mentioned that OpenUK is a part of it. It's looking at building a data infrastructure for Europe. The intention is for it all to be built on open source, and that this will create a cloud environment and a distributed data and infrastructure model for Europe. And it's something that, although the UK has left the EU, we can still participate in. So I think it's important that we do. But that's a very tangible example of what I'm talking about with this shift that will require interoperability. Now, open source underdogs. I'm sharing my favorite podcast with you. Mike Schwartz, who does these, runs a company called Glue. And Mike has told me several times that he's taking a pause from these. Yeah, I've discovered that he did a whole bunch in 2020 that I wasn't expecting. I have to say they're brilliant. He's so thorough in the way he researches them, and he brings together many of the leaders of different open source projects. Two of my favorites are older. They are the Rancher and Pivotal pre-acquisition talks, and they were my favorites before these companies got acquired, James Waters and Shannon Williams, and they talk very positively, unlike many of the other founders who were part of that 2018, open core, move away from open source thing. These guys talk really eloquently about how to make a successful cloud environment business. Throwing this in just so that you're aware it exists, Cause, which is, I think, VC-funded commercial open source. I think it's a misnomer because I think open source is potentially commercial. But anyway, commercial open source software organization has this table of IPOs, which I think is worth knowing about and interesting to take a look at. Although the categorization of what's an open source company is also interesting. So why does any of this matter? Well, I'm enough of a fangirl that when I get to go to Linux Foundation events, I have a series of photos of myself with Linus. We're the same age, and it's quite entertaining to watch these get older and older. And it's important because open is our future, and I would say that, and he would say that, right? But don't just listen to us. I'm conscious of time, and I know you probably have questions, so I'm going to rattle through this. But this is a picture of someone who signed up for today, at least the little guy in the front, Steve Wally, who is a good friend of mine. He's at Microsoft for his second stint. And he is in Edinburgh in 2018, in October 2018, and he is keynoting the Linux Foundation's European Summit. And he's keynoting it with this slide of Satya Nadella behind him. And if you read what Satya's quote says, judge us by the actions we have taken in the recent past, our actions today and in the future. Not of 10 plus years ago when Steve Ballmer described open source as a cancer. And the reason that we are looking at this is that at this point in time, Microsoft had just committed its patents to OIN, Open Invention Network, which I mentioned I worked for right back at the beginning. And I've worked with OIN since I was at Canonical, when I took Canonical in as one of the funders. So it's really important. It's part of the good housekeeping and the good hygiene of all open source to be part of it. And Steve is talking here about Microsoft's journey to open source, and he credits it with 3 causes. The first is cloud. And what he says is that they have a product you've probably heard of called Azure, and that if you want to run a cloud computing product, or if you want to run a business based on cloud, you have to be part of open source, not just using it, not just taking it, but you have to give back. So you have to engage with the open source community, and that community will expect to use your patents. Secondly, he acknowledges that 10 years ago, customers would not have asked for open source, and today they do, because open source is at the heart of commerce. And then thirdly, developers. Now, we've seen digital transformation. There are quotes from me which say that it's not just a digital transformation, it's an open source transformation. Companies have come round to understanding that all companies are now software companies. We've seen the rise of DevOps. What we're going to see next is the rise of open source, because they're using it, they're just not necessarily fully engaged. So I agree with Steve on all 3 points, but this last one, that the developers determine what they use. And if you want to hire developers in this very competitive world, this very competitive environment, you want the best, you are going to have to let them work with open source, because that's how they work. There is a whole generation who have grown up since 1989, since the Linux kernel release, who understand nothing else. They're surprised at the existence of organizations like OpenUK, because they don't think, their belief is that it's all fixed. It's sadly not, and we need to protect the future of open. But, it feeds into Steve's points that these developers want to use open. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts. As we continue to code, expect and accept that it's going to be open, and that we build open with collaboration, that requires, if you want to make money from it, to have a good understanding of your licensing and your business models, but not to commit to open source or to a particular license until you understand how you are going to make money. Because you are going to need to be able to eat, and to do that you need a business model. And it's no good to come back later and say, oh, well, I want to be open-ish, because there isn't open-ish. You're either open or you're not open. So with that, I'm going to come back to something that I said right at the beginning. 13 years ago today, I joined a company called Canonical, and I absolutely fell in love with open source. And I fell in love with it partly because I felt like I belonged. And it's very important to everybody at OpenUK that everybody feels that they can belong in OpenUK if they want to, and that there's room for everybody, no matter how you are or what you're like. And on Sunday, we are going to be sharing something on social media for Valentine's Day. So everybody will get a Valentine's from OpenUK. But I'd be really grateful if you would spend 5 minutes just taking a look at that. And if you feel so inclined, share it for us on Sunday. With that, over to questions. I'm going to take this deck down, if that's okay, and maximize. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So yes, do we have any questions?
Don't tell me I've talked at you so much that there's nothing for anyone to ask, or I've given you all the answers. No questions. Oh my goodness. Sammy, you must have.
Sammy's got one.
There you are. I'm sorry.
Nobody wants to ask a question, but it's more of a comment than a question, Amanda. The discussion about the business model. I think this applies to any project, regardless of which route you decide to take. I think very often people start with, well, we just want to make it open, and then think about, well, how is the business model going to work? But I think I would flip it the other way. You're absolutely right that ask what do you want to do? What is your business model? And then see whether that open fits in with what your plans, or it might be that it partially fits in with your plan, because you could sort of say, okay, I'm going to do part of or half of this activity in the open and half of it not in the open, and anybody else can do the same thing, but I'm not going to share the bit or contribute or open the bit that I think is where I add value. And we see quite a lot of that in our industry.
And I think that's absolutely right. It comes back to working out what you're doing when you start a business. I think HashiCorp's Open Source Underdogs podcast, I'm obsessed with these. I just think they're the best thing. if you listen to that, they talk about how, and it was set up by two really young guys. They set up this project and it grew and grew and grew, and they never intended it to be a business. Now, for me, they are the exception that proves the rule, who has an excuse for not having thought through their business model and having gone down the open source route. But they also demonstrate the way that open source allows new code, new software, new packages, new projects, new businesses to scale. And that's something that Shannon Williams and his talks about extensively, that you can create this scale because you don't have to go through the procurement process. It's not slow. It's really agile. It gets into business. CTOs can kick the tires on your code and work out whether it's for you. And you can really get a traction through being open source that you may not get another way. But it's only valuable if you know what your end goal is going to be and how you're going to monetize that if that's what you want to do. So, being the de facto standard is great, but if you're hungry, you're still hungry.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with startups, they very often sort of bright young engineers, as I would choose with developers, that don't really have the business sort of not understanding, but they don't have the business mindset. So when people ask, I would always say, so who's running your business activity? Because you need that as well as the intelligent, clever, sort of developing ideas and inventions. You have to have somebody thinking, okay, what is the business model here? How can we scale it? And that is what is needed. There's very different activities, and very few people can do both, to be honest with you. I mean, in my observations in the years that I've been involved with smaller companies and with, I work for Arm, sort of it has always been that you need that sort of business-minded people involvement. At the beginning for startups, that is quite difficult because you have to hire somebody else, and you don't have the money, you don't have the resources to do that.
I think there's sorry, somebody's ringing my doorbell. I'm trying to ignore them. The joy of presenting live from home. The thing with that is that there are some exceptional individuals who are amazing developers and amazing business people. But if we assume that nobody has to be that talented, one of the things I hope we'll share with this book is that we will begin to give some of that information to people. It's possible to go and speak to professional advisors for your first meeting on a free basis, and if they have integrity, they will talk it through properly with you and explain the risks. And I think increasingly there are tools like these conversations, and it's one of the upsides of the pandemic is that there's more and more like this that's available to people. But we do often see, not just in open source, but in startups generally, a CTO who's brilliant, who is good enough to get it going, but then needs somebody else to come in and help them mature the organization. And I think that's your danger point, is to make sure that CTO, that founder, that developer doesn't go too far and doesn't assume that they know everything. And it's that assumption. In Canonical, I had a great time. I have to say that I really respect developers, and many of them know a lot more about open source licensing than I ever will. Right, and they've got the mindset for it that I don't, with that absolute detail, and that's brilliant. But they have less experience of running businesses, and I think that that's the really important point, is to go and get people who've got that experience to help you. And I know lots of people will talk to you and become advisors. It's increasingly common for people like myself, Sammy. I don't know if this is something you can do while you're employed, but I've just gone into Momoto, a startup in the West Coast, on the security side as an advisor, because they wanted a lawyer and their advisory board. And you see that more and more. So I think people are beginning to understand the value of having those conversations early stage.
Yeah, no, we do. You're absolutely right. You can, and certainly, generally, I would say to people, just get some initial advice. Get even if you're going to train somebody else, whether it's your CTO or whether it's your salesperson, to get that sort of commercial mindset. Just give them those tips and hints to build up that expertise.
Yeah, and one of the things I noticed with the people who'd signed up for this talk is there were a few of them I know personally who are West Coast who I never thought would make it, but I assume that they're going to watch it on YouTube afterwards. So I think it's just worth repeating. We're going to put this up tonight and on YouTube quicker than we normally do, because Matt has very kindly been doing some drawings. I don't know if, Matt, you want to share your screen and show us some of the drawings that you've done before we wrap up. That's super cool. Are you going to show us any more, or just this one? Maybe there is just this one, of course. I say just. And Adam has been doing this live blog, which is going on to journalism's site, but will also go on to the OpenUK blog post, and I will share them across social media late afternoon because we know there's a lot of interest in this topic.
Thank you. Any more questions? We've still got a couple of minutes.
Oh, Katie, let them off the hook.
Okay, I'm gone. Okay, well, thank you so much again, Amanda, for such an interesting talk. And next week we've got a break, so we will be back on February the 26th, where it will be Denise Cooper talking about the story of the COVID tracker island in Ireland and how open source can change the world. So hopefully see lots of you there in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks, everybody, for your patience today.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.